On a spring morning in 2017, a mother of 3 in Evansville, Indiana, logged on to Facebook and noticed a story in her news feed that made her heart start to race. Just a couple of hours earlier, the body of a young woman had been found in a field one town over, and police still had no clue who the young woman was. Now, the physical description was vague, but it matched all 3 of the mother's daughters. So right away, she picked up her phone and began trying to reach each of them to make sure they were okay. Her 2 youngest girls replied within minutes, but the oldest one of them did not. And with every minute that passed by without a word from her, the mother became more and more frantic, until she finally reached out to a friend of hers on the police force. And what she would soon learn before the morning ended would change her family's life forever and change the course of 2 separate police investigations. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast. Because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please tape an air horn behind the follow button's front door to act as their new door stomp. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the afternoon of Sunday, April 23rd, 2017, 20-year-old Haley Rathgeber walked across the busy dining room of the Texas Roadhouse restaurant in Evansville, Indiana, carrying 2 plates of hot food from the kitchen. Haley stopped at a table near a window and set the plates down in front of a pair of customers. Then, she gave a big smile and told them to enjoy the meal. But as Haley walked back towards the kitchen, she happened to glance up at the clock on the wall, and when she saw the time, her smile totally disappeared and she felt this jolt of anxiety. Haley knew in a little under an hour, her shift would be over an hour, and she would no longer have work to take her mind off this insane secret that she was keeping from almost everybody she knew. Earlier that month, one of Haley's best friends, a young woman named Jordan Hughes, had lost her 10-month-old baby in a devastating accident. Jordan's boyfriend, who was not the baby's father but was helping take care of him, had been home alone with the baby. He'd strapped the baby into a car seat and started walking down the stairs in the house when he suddenly tripped over a diaper bag, and he and the baby both went tumbling down the steps, which ultimately resulted in the child's death. Or at least that's what he had told his girlfriend, Jordan, and the police. Jordan had gotten the news quickly about her child and rushed to the hospital, hoping her baby would survive, and she told Haley everything that had happened and asked Haley to go to her house to pick up some things for her and bring them back to the hospital. But when Haley got to Jordan's house, she quickly realized that the story Jordan's boyfriend had told them didn't make any sense. The diaper bag that the boyfriend had supposedly tripped over was neatly placed on the couch, and it looked like it had never even been used, let alone tripped over in this dramatic fashion that the boyfriend had described. Haley had also noticed there were no scuff marks on the stairs or the nearby wall. Nothing anywhere inside the house appeared to be damaged or in disorder, and practically everything she saw seemed to contradict the boyfriend's story. And so, by the time Haley had left Jordan's house, she was convinced that Jordan's boyfriend, a guy named Thaddeus Rice, was lying. And when the baby had eventually died at the hospital, Haley felt almost positive that Thaddeus had something to do with the baby's death. Back in the busy restaurant, Haley grabbed more food from the kitchen and delivered it to one of her tables. For some reason, whenever she was helping customers or talking to her close friends she worked with, a small group that called themselves the Roadies, she could totally block out everything she'd seen in Jordan's house. The second she closed out her final table, Haley felt like she might have a panic attack right there in the middle of the restaurant. Haley took a seat at the restaurant bar and tried to catch her breath. She removed her work apron, and then reached inside the front pouch of the apron and pulled out a thick wad of cash, her tip money for the night. She slipped the cash into her jeans pocket and just kept taking deep breaths, trying as hard as she could to calm herself down. Haley suddenly felt a hand on her back, and she turned and saw her friend and co-worker, Ainsley Bowles, take the seat next to her. Haley had only shared the secret with 2 people, her mother and Ainsley. And while Haley's mother had told her to go talk to the police immediately about Thaddeus, Ainsley understood why Haley still had not done that. Because Ainsley and Haley were both afraid of Thaddeus. He was their friend's boyfriend, so they'd always tried to get along with him. But They knew Thaddeus had a criminal record and had been involved in at least one rape case. Ainsley asked Haley how she was holding up, but before Haley could answer, another member of the roadie crew, Jake Allen, walked up to the bar and announced that he was hosting a small hangout after he got off work, and if anybody wanted to come over and have drinks, they were welcome. He said so far their friend and fellow roadie Isaiah would be there, but he was hoping more people would come. Haley thought about it for a second. Now, she loved hanging out with Jake and Isaiah, and specifically with Jake and Isaiah, she would typically confide in both of them about everything, like she did with Ainsley. But right now, she just didn't want to tell these guys what was going on with her, because Jake and Isaiah could be very protective of Haley on Ainsley, and she didn't want them doing anything stupid or drastic once they learned about her theory around Thaddeus and the baby. Also, Haley and Ainsley had a big exam in one of their college classes the following morning, and so ultimately, Haley and Ainsley thanked Jake for the offer but said they would both have to pass this time. Jake said he totally understood, but if either of them changed their minds, they knew how to reach him. Jake returned to work, and Haley and Ainsley stayed at the bar. And at some point, in a voice barely above a whisper, Ainsley asked Haley if she was going to finally tell Thaddeus's girlfriend or the cops about her suspicions. Haley looked down and said she still had no clue. Every time she thought about it, she got so scared about what Thaddeus might do to her. Later that evening, Haley was at her apartment alone, studying for her big exam and still trying to keep her mind off of everything else, when she heard her phone vibrate on the table. She put down her notes, looked at her phone, and saw a text message. After reading it, Haley thought about it for a second. She knew she really should keep on studying, but this diversion might help her relax for a bit. So she picked up her phone and replied to the message, and then afterward, she headed to the bathroom to put on some makeup, and also change out of her shirt and sweats and put on a pair of jeans, a long-sleeved shirt, and a jacket. She was ready to go out. The next morning, so April 24th, a woman was driving her daughter to school along the route she always took. She knew this route so well, in fact, that sometimes she found herself zoning out completely while driving, almost like she was on autopilot. But on this morning, as she approached the soccer field that stood out from the endless grassy overgrowth that surrounded the area, something caught this woman's attention. At first, she couldn't make out what she was seeing. All she could tell was that there was something strange in the soccer field's gravel parking lot. And then, as she continued down the road and got a little bit closer and realized what she was seeing, the woman slammed on the brakes and told her daughter to wait in the car. The woman got out of her car and ran over to the soccer parking lot, hoping maybe her eyes had just played a trick on her and she hadn't really seen what she thought she saw. But when she got closer, she knew she had been right. She grabbed her phone and called 911. About 15 minutes later, so just after 7, at 0 a.m., Warwick County Sheriff's investigator Paul Cruz pulled up to the soccer field, got out of his unmarked police car, and made his way past the yellow crime scene tape. Cruz greeted the deputies and members of the forensics team who had arrived shortly before him. Then he walked past them and continued a bit further across the lot, and there he saw a young woman lying dead in the gravel. Cruz knelt down next to her and saw a wound in the back of her head, which clearly looked like it came from a gunshot. And he also saw a blue towel that was covered in blood lying next to her. Cruz scanned the ground near the body, and he didn't see any drag marks or anything to indicate that this young woman had been taken to this location by force. He and the forensics team would obviously need to do a lot more work, but for now, Cruz figured the most logical explanation was that this young woman had been walking through the lot when someone approached her from behind and shot her. Cruz looked around the lot and got an eerie feeling. He didn't see a single street light or lamppost anywhere in sight. This area was totally desolate. So if this young woman had been killed last night or early in the morning, it would have been pitch black here. Cruz had no idea why this young woman was walking through this dark parking lot, but he did know it would have been really easy for someone to follow her without ever being seen. Cruz crouched down over the body again, and he noticed an area of bare gravel on both sides of one of the dead woman's legs. It almost looked like she had made a partial snow angel in the gravel with that leg, and this really upset Cruz. because it likely meant that this young woman had not died immediately after being shot. She had fallen to the ground and squirmed before dying. Cruz stood back up and stepped away from the body, and then asked a crime scene investigator if he or anyone else had found a wallet or any kind of it at the scene. But the crime scene investigator just shook his head. The dead woman had nothing on her, no wallet, no cell phone, no keys, nothing on her. They had no idea who this victim was. Later that morning, about 15 miles away from that soccer field, Haley's mother, Heather Collins, poured herself a mug of coffee, sat down on her front porch, and opened up her laptop. Heather began by scrolling through Facebook, which she did every morning. But as she read through the posts in her feed, she began seeing something that disturbed her. All her friends from town were posting the same story from the local news. It was about this unidentified young woman who was found dead that morning outside of town. Heather's kids were 3 young women, all close in age, and so Heather immediately felt the maternal instinct to check on them and make sure each of them was okay. And so, she promptly sent text messages to her 2 youngest daughters, and then also to Haley, her oldest daughter. And within minutes, her phone lit up, and Heather was relieved to see responses from her 2 younger girls. But she didn't get a response from Haley. However, she wasn't surprised, because she knew Haley had an important exam that morning, and Haley usually prioritized school over anything else. But an hour went by, and Heather still had not heard from Haley, so she called Haley's phone. The call went straight to voicemail. Heather left her daughter a message, trying to disguise how worried she was starting to feel. The next 30 minutes slowed to a crawl as Haley still didn't get in touch with her mother. And so, finally, Heather picked up her phone again and she called Haley's friend Ainsley, who went to the same college as Haley. Ainsley answered, and before Heather could even explain why she was calling, Ainsley asked her what was going on. She said Haley had not shown up to class that morning and missed the big exam. When Haley's mother heard this, she immediately felt sick to her stomach and had this horrible sense of dread come over her. Heather hung up and began talking aloud, trying to soothe herself. This was not her child up by the soccer field. It couldn't be her. It can't be her. Heather kept repeating this over and over again, like a mantra, trying to convince herself that Haley was really safe. But it didn't work. So, after desperately waiting to hear back from Haley for a bit longer and still not hearing from her, Heather grabbed her phone once more and called a friend of hers who happened to be a detective for the Evansville Police Department. And when the detective answered, Heather told him that she had heard the news about the unidentified body and she couldn't get in touch with her daughter Haley, and she was now really worried. Heather's detective friend told her that, given where the body was found, this case was actually out of his jurisdiction. However, he did have some contacts at the Warwick County Sheriff's Office, and he said he would call them to see what he could find out. Heather provided her detective friend a physical description of Haley. She had long, light brown hair with blonde highlights, and her teeth were always really bright white. Heather also told the detective the type of clothing Haley typically wore, and she sent him pictures of Haley's tattoos. Then she hung up and waited. A short time later, Heather's phone rang. It was now the Warwick County Sheriff's Office calling, and when they spoke to her, they said they actually wanted to speak to her in person. Haley's mother immediately began to shake, and she felt the blood drain from her face. She could think of only one reason why they would want to talk to her face to face, and she just wanted to curl up and die, anything but face the news she knew she was about to hear. A short time later, Heather heard a knock on her door. When she opened it up, she saw it was deputies from the Warwick County Sheriff's Office. Heather immediately began to shake all over, and she felt the blood drain from her face. And as soon as she heard one of the deputies utter the words, "I'm sorry," Heather broke down and collapsed to the floor. Her daughter, Haley, was dead. Later that afternoon, investigator Cruz walked away from the crime scene at the soccer field, got into his car, and began driving across town. And as he drove, he felt very frustrated. Earlier, he'd gotten a call from the station, so he now knew his victim was a college student named Haley Rathgeber, but that was about all he knew. He and his team had thoroughly combed the crime scene and the area surrounding it, but almost nothing had come from their search. Not even a single shell casing had turned up. In fact, the only evidence that had been bagged at the scene was that bloody blue towel found next to the body, which the medical examiner was sending off to the crime lab for DNA analysis. After a short drive, investigator Cruz pulled into the sheriff's station, and he walked in just as Heather, Haley's mom, was arriving. She was there to get more information about what happened to her daughter. Cruz very gently approached Heather, who was clearly still crying, and he told her how sorry he was that her daughter was gone, and he promised that he'd find out who did this and bring that person to justice. Cruz understood now was not a great time to sit down and ask Heather a bunch of questions, but he said he did need to ask her one thing. Could she think of anyone at all, who might have wanted to hurt Haley? Haley's mother didn't even hesitate. She looked right at Cruz and said she knew of one person for sure who would want to do this: Thaddeus Rice. When Cruz heard this name, he did a double take. Cruz knew this name very well because Thaddeus Rice was a suspect in another case he was currently working on. So now Cruz really wanted to know more if Heather was comfortable still sharing. Heather said of course, and she proceeded to tell him the whole story. And as Cruz listened to Heather, he knew exactly where the story was going, because the story was the other case he was investigating: the death of Thaddeus's girlfriend's baby boy. Heather told Cruz that Haley suspected Thaddeus might have been directly involved in the death of that baby. And so Heather said if Thaddeus knew Haley suspected him, he would have every reason to want to shut her up. Before Cruz could even respond, Heather took her phone out of her pocket and told him she needed to show him something. She unlocked her phone and quickly pulled up a message that a friend of Haley's had sent her just before Cruz had arrived at the station. It was a video that Thaddeus had recently posted to his social media, and in this video, Thaddeus is seen posing with a gun. Immediately after seeing this video, Cruz thanked Heather for the information, and he turned around, got back into his car, and drove to Thaddeus's workplace. And when he got there, Thaddeus happened to be outside on a break. However, the second Cruz stepped out of his car, Thaddeus waved him away dismissively and said he had nothing to say to him. Cruz made it clear to Thaddeus that he was not there to talk about the dead baby. Instead, he was there to talk about Haley. Thaddeus just stared back at Cruz, and Cruz honestly couldn't tell if Thaddeus was confused or scared. Finally, though, Thaddeus said he wouldn't talk to cops without an attorney, and then he turned and walked away. Cruz knew he could go after Thaddeus, but he also knew it wouldn't make a difference. Thaddeus was not about to talk to him. Thaddeus had been involved in enough criminal cases to understand his rights. But even without having a long conversation with him, Thaddeus's reaction to hearing Haley's name had just made him seem a whole lot more suspicious. Around the same time Cruz was confronting Thaddeus, a young man named Isaiah Hagen sat on his front porch staring at his phone. Isaiah was Haley's close friend and co-worker, one of the members of the roadies crew. And right now, he was looking at a series of text messages from other members of that group, specifically his friends Jake and Dainsley, saying that Haley had been found dead by the soccer field just outside of town. And so, Isaiah was just processing it and beginning to cry. And then, right at that moment, he heard his mother inside the house behind him, and he instinctively just got up, went inside, and hugged his mom and began crying even harder. She asked him what was wrong, and Isaiah told her about Haley. And his mom couldn't believe what she was hearing. She worked for the county sheriff, so she knew all about the young woman who had been found at the soccer field. But she had no idea this young woman was one of her son's good friends. Isaiah hugged his mother tighter and told her that none of this made any sense because he'd just seen Haley the night before and everything had seemed fine. How could she be dead? Isaiah's mom pulled away from him, and she told him she understood how upset he was, but he really needed to go talk to the lead investigator right away. Because even if Isaiah didn't realize it, he might have seen something or heard Haley say something last night that could help investigators find her killer. Cruz was at the station sitting at his desk, looking through Thaddeus's rap sheet when his phone rang. He picked up the call and Isaiah introduced himself and said that his mother worked at the sheriff's station. Cruz asked if everything was okay, and Isaiah said he was calling about his friend Haley, the girl who had been found at the soccer field. He explained to Cruz that he had just seen Haley the night before, and he wanted to help if he could. Cruz told Isaiah that he could help by walking him through everything he remembered from the previous night. This would help Cruz flesh out the timeline of Haley's final hours. Isaiah told Cruz that the night before, he had been at his friend Jake Allen's place playing video games when he got a text message from Haley. And in this text, she said she was going to meet someone at a local park where the college students sometimes hang out. And she asked Isaiah if he could give her a ride because she didn't want to leave her car there. Isaiah said that was no problem. So, he had left Jake's place, went to Haley's, hung out with her for a minute, and then drove her to the park. Isaiah told Cruz he had no idea who she was meeting. He said he didn't ask her about it because it felt like it was none of his business, especially if she was meeting up with some guy who she was romantically involved with. Isaiah said after he dropped Haley off, he just went back to Jake's house and kept playing video games until very early in the morning. Inspector Cruz kept listening and writing everything down, but then suddenly Isaiah just went silent, and Cruz could hear him trying to catch his breath. And when Isaiah started talking again, it was clear he was very upset. He told Cruz he felt really guilty now, and he wished he had asked Haley who she was meeting, because maybe he could have done something to protect her, or at a minimum today, been able to provide the police a suspect. Cruz told Isaiah that he appreciated him calling in and that he would follow up if he had any questions. After getting off the phone with Isaiah, Cruz quickly scanned the list of co-workers that Haley worked with at the Texas Roadhouse, and just as he remembered, there was Jake Allen's name and a phone number right next to it. And so, Cruz called Jake and asked him if he could verify the times he had hung out with Isaiah the night before. And Jake corroborated Isaiah's story. But while speaking to Jake, Investigator Cruz looked up Jake's address, and he saw that Jake lived very close to the park where Isaiah said he dropped Haley off. And that park was only a few miles from the soccer field where Haley was found dead. And so, Cruz began to question Jake about his own activities the previous night, and pretty quickly, the call took a very weird turn. Now, Cruz considered all of Haley's friends and co-workers to be possible suspects, but he really thought this call might just be a chance to cross Jake off his list. But Cruz noticed that Jake suddenly started to sound very nervous and defensive as soon as his actions were called into questions. Jake insisted that he hadn't seen Haley at all the previous night. In fact, he hadn't seen Haley since work that afternoon. He said he had invited her and their other friend Ainsley over to hang out, but they both had declined. And then, after talking about Haley for a minute, Jake suddenly shifted gears back to Isaiah, saying he thought it was very strange how Isaiah would just doctor Haley out to the park and leave her there. Cruz let Jake keep talking, but he wondered if Jake had something to hide and if that's why he was throwing suspicion onto his friend Isaiah. After hanging up with Jake, Cruz went back to his list of everyone who had worked at the Roadhouse with Haley. Up until this call, Cruz had really only been focused on Thaddeus, who didn't work at the Roadhouse, and he definitely still considered Thaddeus a major suspect with a very clear motive. But now, Cruz felt like he really should put some additional attention on the Roadhouse employees, specifically Jake and Isaiah. On the evening of April 26th, so 2 days after Haley's body had been found, Cruz and a couple of members from his team arrived at Jake's apartment. Cruz knocked on the door and Jake's roommate answered. Cruz introduced himself and asked to speak to Jake. The young man turned and shouted for Jake, looking a little freaked out that a bunch of cops had just shown up at his door. And then the roommate walked away. A few seconds later, Jake approached the door wearing a dress shirt with an untied tie hanging on the collar. Cruz said he was the detective who had talked to Jake on the phone and he needed to ask him a few more questions. Jake said he understood, but he was getting ready to leave for a candlelight vigil some friends and family were having for Haley. This made Cruz pause for a second. His investigation wasn't even 2 days old, and he'd been going pretty much nonstop since it started. And he'd almost overlooked how young Haley was and how many people her death must have affected. Still, Cruz needed some answers. He told Jake he would do his best not to keep him too long, but he needed Jake to go through everything he had done after he'd seen Haley at work on the day she died. And just like Jake had said to Cruz on the phone, he said after work he had gone home and met up with Isaiah to play video games. It was basically the same story. However, during this in-person exchange, Jake also said something about Isaiah that really stood out to Cruz and made him look at the case very differently. Cruz took notes on everything Jake told him, asked a few follow-up questions, and then he and his team left so Jake could get ready for the vigil. That night, a huge group of Haley's friends and family gathered by the soccer field where Haley had been found. The candles they lit cast a glow over the otherwise pitch-black parking lot. They laid down flowers, shared some of their favorite memories, and just talked about how much Haley had meant to all of them. Her closest friends from work left Haley's name, tagging her Roadhouse cap and sweatshirt right next to a big hand-made sign that simply said, "We love and miss you, love your roadies." On April 27th, the day after the vigil, Inspector Cruz received word from the crime lab that the results had come in on the bloody blue towel that had been found next to Haley's body. Only one DNA profile was found on the towel, and much to Cruz's disappointment, it was Haley's. Cruz had hoped he would catch a break-in, that these results would lead him right to the killer. But now that he knew that was not going to happen, he methodically went through his list of Haley's friends and co-workers another time. Thaddeus, who remained one of Cruz's primary suspects, still refused to say anything without a lawyer. But almost everyone else who had known Haley was willing to help and tell Cruz whatever they could. And the more Cruz spoke to Haley's friends, the more convinced he became that he was much closer to solving this case than he had initially thought, because a lot of Haley's friends said things that pointed him in the same direction. So, Cruz came up with an idea of how he might be able to track Haley's movements before she got to the soccer field where she was ultimately found. He got in his car, headed to Haley's neighborhood, and just started knocking on the door of every house or apartment complex he saw that had a security camera or a doorbell with a video camera He asked anyone who answered if he could have the footage from their cameras to help him solve a crime, and everyone he spoke to said he absolutely did. And so, after Cruz collected all of that footage from Haley's neighborhood, he did the same exact thing in Thaddeus's girlfriend's neighborhood, which is where Thaddeus spent most of his time. Over the next couple of days, Cruz sat at the station and sifted through hours upon hours of security footage that he had collected. The experience began to remind Cruz of the old cliché about watching paint dry, and at times, Cruz felt he'd much rather be looking at a freshly painted wall than at endless, grainy footage of houses and apartment buildings in suburban Indiana. Cruz kept fighting off sleep and tried to keep his eyes glued on the footage as hours passed by without anything eventful happening, until he hit pay dirt. For a second, Cruz wasn't even really sure he was seeing what he thought he was seeing. After all, watching this footage for so long had basically sent him into a daze. So he rewound the footage and watched it again, and this time, he was sure he did see something that would help him close the case and bring Haley's murderer to justice. Cruz watched more footage to make sure he wasn't missing something. He also worked with his team to collect cell phone data, and he carried out a few more interviews just to be certain he was on the right track. And on April 29th, just 5 days after Haley's body was found, Inspector Cruz knew he had found Haley's killer. He arrested them, and after that, he discovered exactly what had happened to Haley on the night she died. Based on surveillance footage, interviews, and evidence gathered throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Haley Rathgeber on the night of April 23, 2017. Around 10:30 p.m. that night, the killer fished a 9mm handgun out of the closet and then left to go meet up with Haley. Haley got into the killer's car, and the killer began driving her to the soccer field just outside of town. When they got there, Haley and the killer stepped out of the car and began walking across the gravel parking lot near the field, with only the headlights of the killer's car and the flashlight on Haley's phone to light the way. As they walked, the killer let Haley walk ahead of them, and without Haley noticing, the killer silently drew their 9mm handgun, raised it up, aimed him, and fired a single shot into the back of Haley's head. Haley stumbled, and the killer took several steps back and watched as she fell. Haley collapsed onto her back. The only part of her body that was working now was her left leg, which she jerked back and forth in the gravel as her brain slowly shut down. The killer just stood there and watched as Haley died. And in that moment, for a second, the killer felt bad about what they had just done. But regardless, after she was dead, the killer turned away from the body, went back to their car, and grabbed a blue towel they happened to have in the back seat. The killer then walked back to Haley's body, knelt down, and used the towel to wipe up some of the blood. After that, they put the towel down and then scooped up Haley's phone off the ground. They also reached into her pocket and pulled out her wallet, which contained $200 in cash. And then the killer stood up, took one more look at the body, and then turned and ran back to the car, carrying their gun and Haley's stuff with them. Later that night, the killer went to their friend's place and hung out playing video games all night, without ever showing the slightest hint of what they had just done. Haley's close friend and fellow roadie, Isaiah Hagen, was her killer. Isaiah, whose mother worked for the sheriff's department, had called Inspector Cruz and tried to make it look like he was helping the investigation. And Isaiah's call even threw some suspicion on his friend Jake for a time. However, when Cruz and his team met with Jake on the night of the candlelight vigil, Jake started talking about his friend Isaiah. He hated to admit it because the two young men had been really close for years, but Jake said Isaiah had been acting really strange lately, and this was because Isaiah had run into some serious money problems. It turned out that leading up to the murder, Isaiah had borrowed hundreds of dollars from his father and from Haley. While Haley had not confronted Isaiah about the money he owed her, Isaiah's father wanted to get paid back. So Isaiah decided to take the money he owed his dad from Haley. On the night of the murder, Isaiah was the one who texted Haley while she was studying and asked her if they could hang out because he really wanted to talk to her. And Haley decided she needed a break from studying and from everything else that was going on in her life, so she said yes. Isaiah picked Haley up, but he never drove her to the park to meet someone else like he had told police. Instead, he drove right to the soccer field. And shortly after getting out of the car, he shot and killed her. It's not clear if Isaiah first tried to just ask Haley for the money and, maybe she refused to give him money and that's what led to the murder, or if Isaiah simply picked Haley up with every intention of murdering her for the money. Either way, it resulted in Haley's death and Isaiah stealing the $200 out of her wallet. In the morning following the murder, right before sunrise, Isaiah drove around town getting rid of his gun and Haley's belongings. And then he went back to his house and left the $200 from her wallet on the kitchen counter for his dad. After speaking to Jake in person, Cruz really began to suspect that Isaiah was the killer. But he still could not just write off Thaddeus, a man who had a criminal history, had potentially harmed or even killed a baby, and who Haley had been afraid of before she died. So Cruz collected self-owned data for Haley and also for both Isaiah and Thaddeus, and he also studied all the surveillance footage he had collected. Isaiah and Haley's cell phone data showed that they had at least been near the same locations, including the soccer field, at the same time on the night of the murder. And the surveillance footage showed Isaiah pulling up to Haley's place not too long before she was killed. The footage also showed that Thaddeus had been at his girlfriend's house at the time of the murder and throughout the entire night. And so, even though the murder weapon was not recovered, Cruz felt confident he'd cracked the case and he arrested Isaiah. Isaiah insisted he would never hurt Haley and that he was innocent, but during his trial, his mother was put on the witness stand and she testified that Isaiah had privately admitted to her that he'd been the one who shot Haley. He had told his mother it was an accident, but the evidence in the case did not support that. It took the jury only 4 hours to find Isaiah guilty. In early August of 2018, he was sentenced to 60 years in prison. Thaddeus, who Haley believed had played a part in the death of his girlfriend's baby, was eventually found guilty of neglect of a dependent and reckless homicide in the death of the child. On a Monday afternoon in 19 Texas, a detective sergeant in San Antonio, Texas, sat in his office and puzzled over the separate cases that landed on his desk that morning. One was a missing persons case. A mother of 2 never showed up to work that morning at the clinic where she was a respected nurse, and none of her friends, co-workers, or family members could get in touch with her. The other case involved a murder. A body had turned up in a grassy field along a deserted Tulane road, and it appeared to be a teenage girl. The sergeant looked back and forth between the description of the missing mom and the pictures of the dead young woman. These women were so similar in appearance that he wondered if this may have been the work of a serial killer. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast. because that's all we do and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please buy the follow button a very nice pair of slippers, but each week. Secretly break into their house and replace those slippers with an identical pair that is slightly larger. Okay, let's get into today's story. On a muggy Saturday night on June 7th, 1996, 29-year-old Kathy Lipscomb parked her car in front of an apartment complex in San Antonio, Texas, and reached into her purse for a tube of lipstick. Kathy tilted the rearview mirror toward her face and touched up her lips, and as she looked at her reflection and swept her platinum bangs to the side of her forehead, she almost didn't recognize herself. There was a glow on her face that she hadn't seen in a long time, not since she'd been a newlywed. These days, the happy parts of Kathy's marriage felt very far in the past. Over the last 8 years, she and her husband had had 2 children who they both loved deeply. But Kathy had come to feel increasingly trapped in her life until just about a month ago, when she and her husband had finally agreed to separate. To Kathy, that decision felt like it gave her back her freedom, and she knew that who she was seeing now in the rearview mirror of her brand new car was a brand new woman. Kathy grabbed her purse from the passenger seat, got out of the car, and walked towards the large apartment building up ahead. And suddenly, she felt really nervous, but it was the good kind of nervous. She had butterflies in her stomach because she was on the way to spend the night with her new boyfriend, who she had fallen completely in love with. Kathy's soon-to-be ex-husband had the kids, and for at least a little while, Kathy could put all her worries out of her mind. So, she walked up 2 flights of stairs to the 3rd floor of the building and then rang the doorbell of her boyfriend's apartment. Kathy heard footsteps drawing closer, and then the door opened up and Kathy beamed at the man standing there. The man grabbed Kathy and kissed her, led her inside, and shut the door behind them. The next evening, Kathy's soon-to-be ex-husband, 30-year-old Air Force Master Sergeant Bill Lipscomb, buckled their 4-year-old son and 7-year-old daughter into the back seat of his car and began driving to the other side of town, where Kathy had just moved into her own apartment. Kathy was supposed to pick the kids up from Bill's house, but she hadn't shown up and she wasn't answering her phone. So now, Bill was driving the kids to her. When they got to Kathy's building, Bill knocked on the front door of Kathy's unit, which was on the ground floor, and he and the kids waited there in silence. When she didn't answer the door, Bill knocked again, but still there was no answer. He turned to his kids and tried to smile because he didn't want to upset them, but he knew this was actually really weird. Kathy was never even late picking up their kids, so the idea that she just would blow it off entirely and then also not be home made no sense. Bill told the kids to wait at the door, and then he walked back to his car. He got a notepad, a pen, and a roll of tape out of the glove box and walked back to the building. Bill wrote a note stating that he and the kids were there at 6:45 and would try again later. Then he stuck that note to Kathy's front door. Then he looked down at the kids and asked them if they wanted to write their mama a note. The little girl nodded and took the pen from her and scribbled onto the pad. And Bill tore out the page and stuck that to the door as well. The note read in large block letters, "Mommy, we love you." A day later, at around 9:00 a.m. on Monday morning, a woman working at a university health clinic named Sarah Bowers had a question for Kathy Lipscomb, who was one of the nurses that she worked with. So Sarah walked over to Kathy's office, but when she stepped inside, it was empty. And Sarah saw that a bunch of pink while you were out memos had piled up on Kathy's desk. Sarah walked in and picked up one of the messages and read it. It was from Kathy's husband, Bill. He had called in an hour earlier looking for his wife, and this, coupled with a stack of other notes that were very similar, gave Sarah a bad feeling in the pit of her stomach. Because Kathy was one of the most reliable nurses in the clinic. Like, where had she gone? Why hadn't she called in? Sarah picked up the phone and dialed Kathy's apartment number. She knew it because she and Kathy were actually friends outside of work, but the call just rang, without an answer. And Sarah eventually hung up and returned to her desk. But over the next hour, Sarah could barely focus because all she could think about was Kathy. She kept looking up at the clock on the wall, watching the minutes tick by, hoping to see her friend walk into the office with a totally reasonable explanation for why she was late. Or even without an explanation, it didn't matter, so long as Sarah knew Kathy was okay. By the time the clock struck 10 that morning and Kathy still had not shown up to work, Sarah could not stand it any longer. She got up and walked directly to the office of her and Kathy's boss, Dr. David Pearl. When Dr. Pearl saw Sarah standing at his door with a troubled look on her face, he asked her what was wrong. Sarah told him that Kathy was 2 hours late to work and she was not answering her phone. And based on the notes on her desk that were piling up, her husband had also not heard from her either. At this, Dr. Pearl furrowed his brow. Kathy hadn't mentioned anything to him about being late or absent that day. It made him concerned that she might be sick or maybe even injured and couldn't get to the phone. So he asked Sarah to drive over to Kathy's apartment to check on her. Sarah sped over to Kathy's apartment, which was only about 10 minutes away. When she got there, she found the notes on the door and she knocked, but there was no answer. And so, feeling kind of desperate, she ran to get the building manager and begged the woman to let her into her friend's apartment. Now, the manager knew this was against company policy to do this, but she could see how upset Sarah was. So she unlocked Kathy's door and let Sarah go inside. And what Sarah found inside sent her panic through the roof. The apartment was perfectly neat and tidy. It didn't look like anything bad had happened to her, but there was no sign of Kathy. In fact, it looked like she had not been home for days. At around the same time, about 15 miles away, an airman who worked at the local Air Force base was driving to work down a Tulane road outside of town when he noticed something lying in the grass on the side of the road. The airman pulled over to the shoulder and got out of his car to investigate. He walked off the road and into the grass and stared down into the weeds in utter disbelief. When he got over the initial shock, he ran back to his car, drove to the nearest house, and called the police. It took police officers from the Berkshire County Sheriff's Office just a few minutes to arrive at the spot on the road where the airman had made his discovery. It was a strange location for a 911 call. The area was pretty much deserted, and this road was basically only used by Air Force personnel who drove in and out of the base. The police got out of their cruiser and walked to the side of the road into some spiky grass, and just a few feet in, they stopped for a minute. They just stood there together in silence looking down because there, lying in the weeds below, they saw the dead body of what looked like a teenage girl. She was naked and covered with ants, and they saw thin trails of blood on the sides of her mouth, the sides of her mouth. But, as horrifying as all of that was, the officers were actually much more fixated on something else. The girl's body was contorted, her legs were bent at the knee and her ankles were crossed, as if she had been sitting crisscross style. Her torso had been folded forward so her chest was resting on her legs, and there was some kind of fabric under her foot. The officers had been to enough crime scenes to know that this girl's body had not just been tossed out of a car quickly by a person trying to get rid of evidence. Instead, her body had been carefully posed, like whoever killed her wanted her to be found. That afternoon, homicide investigator Sergeant Marin sat in his office at the sheriff's station trying to hit the victim that police had just found on the side of the road. Marin had started off pretty confident that he would be able to figure out who it was pretty quickly. From the looks of things, the victim appeared to be a teenager and she had been healthy, well cared for, and well groomed. In other words, she looked like she probably had a family who would definitely report her missing right away. But so far, Marin had not been able to find any missing persons reports that matched her description, and he thought that was strange. Just then, a secretary came by and dropped off the medical examiner's report from the autopsy along with the crime scene report. Marin grabbed the medical examiner's report first, and as soon as he opened it, he grimaced. The victim had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death, most likely on Sunday night, so one day before she was found. Her body appeared to have been posed soon after her death, before rigor mortis had set in, which is the stiffening of the body after death. And to Marin, this felt off. Usually, when young women were murdered, the killer was someone they knew, either a partner, friend, or a family member who acted out of rage or jealousy. Sadly, it wasn't unusual to see sexual assault or strangulation in cases like this, but it was extremely unusual to see such deliberate posing of the body. Killers who know their victims often try to cover them up, not display them up. Posing a body was evidence of a careful and deliberate killer acting with a plan. It was something that sadists and serial killers did, and it made Marin think that his killer was likely a stranger to the victim. And that was bad news, because killings by strangers were among the hardest to solve. The suspect pool was enormous because the killer could be anyone. But as Marin continued through the report, he spotted what he thought might be his first clue for strands of long, reed hair that were found on the girl's body. The girl was a blonde, which meant the reed hairs could have come from her killer. The medical examiner had examined these hairs under a microscope, and they found they had been dyed reed and they had no roots. And Marin wasn't sure what to make of this. The hair could be from a wig or they could be from a woman's head, but Marin found it highly unlikely that his killer was female. He put the autopsy report down and picked up the crime scene report. And here, Marin found his second clue. The victim's clothing, which was a pair of Levi's jeans and a t-shirt, had been placed underneath her right foot by the killer. And what Marin noticed was the clothing had been rolled up rather than folded. Marin picked up a pen and wrote down the word military in the margins. Marin knew that people in the military were trained to roll up their clothes instead of folding them because it was more compact and efficient. And the girl's body had been found on a road used almost exclusively by members of the Air Force. But before Marin got too deep into his theories on the killer, his first priority was to find the dead girl's identity. Only then would he be able to begin retracing her last moments and figuring out who she had contact with in her final days. So, over the next hour, he began reaching out to local radio and TV stations, asking producers to broadcast news of the crime every half hour with a description of the young victim. He got the story placement at the top of the afternoon news. Later at 5 p.m., when still no tips had come in, Marin was getting ready to leave and grab something to eat. But just as he was standing up from his desk, his office door swung open and a deputy handed him a single piece of paper. It was a missing persons report for a woman named Kathy Lipscomb. Her family had just called to report that no one had seen or heard from her since Saturday. And the second Marin started reading the report, he felt a rush of adrenaline. Kathy was petite, blonde, and had gone missing right around the time the medical examiner believed his victim had been killed. Marin thought Kathy might be his victim, but then his eyes settled on Kathy's age and he felt his excitement drain away. Kathy was 29 years old, almost 30, but the dead woman found on the side of the road looked a full decade younger than that at least. So, Kathy didn't seem to be a match for his homicide victim. Still, Marin wondered if this missing persons report about Kathy Lipscomb was a different kind of clue in his case, because based on Kathy's physical description, it was eerie how similar the two women were. Marin felt his appetite vanish, and he sat back down at his desk. He was starting to fear that he could have a serial killer on his hands who was hunting petite blonde women, and that Kathy could actually be his second victim. A few hours later, Sergeant Marin's efforts to get the description of his victim blasted out onto the airwaves paid off. By this point, Marin was at home on his couch watching TV when his phone rang. He walked into the kitchen and picked it up. It was the medical examiner's office calling to tell him that a woman watching the news had heard about the discovery of the body and realized that the description of the young victim matched a friend of hers perfectly. At first, this woman had not wanted to believe it, so she actually had gone to her friend's apartment to check on her. But when her friend did not answer the door, the woman had called the police. And the police directed this woman to the medical examiner's office, where she would positively identify the body. Marin's victim finally had a name. When Marin heard the name, he immediately turned to the coffee maker on his counter and started brewing a pot. He was going to have to go straight back to work, because Marin did not have two victims on his hands, he had just one. The dead body of the girl by the side of the road and the missing Kathy Lipscomb were one and the same. Kathy, despite being 29 years old, was just unusually young-looking. This meant that Marin's theory of the case, that he might be dealing with a serial killer, had become a bit more unlikely. He still viewed the posing of the body as evidence that the killer was a stranger to the victim acting on a calculated plan, rather than a sudden burst of emotion. But he was down to just one victim. And now that his victim did have an identity, Marin had to do the part of his job that he hated the most, and that was to tell his victim's family about the murder. About an hour later, Marin met Kathy's husband, Bill Lipscomb, at the sheriff's station. Marin was aware that Bill was a decorated member of the Air Force and that he was very young to be a master sergeant, which was a pretty high rank. So Marin knew that the smartest way to approach Bill was to be formal and polite rather than aggressive, even though divorce was a classic motive for murder and Bill was a natural suspect. So in the interview room, Marin reached out and shook Bill's hand and told him he was very sorry about his wife. He promised to do everything he could to bring her killer to justice. But while Marin was giving Bill his condolences, he was also looking Bill over very carefully, visually checking his arms, his hands, and his face for any signs of injury, like bruises, scratches, or fingernail marks that might be evidence of a recent struggle. But, except for the fact that Bill was pale and sweating, he appeared to be physically unharmed. Marin opened up his notepad and asked Bill where he was over the weekend when Kathy had gone missing. Bill said he had been with his and Kathy's children since Friday afternoon. He said they didn't do much, just kind of hung around the house. Bill said Marin could talk to the kids, and they would tell him the same thing. Marin nodded and then asked Bill how long Kathy had been living in her new apartment. When Bill sighed at the question, Marin looked up from his pad. He was surprised to see that Bill almost looked angry. Bill shook his head and told Marin that Kathy had only been in the new place for about a week or so, but the neighborhood it was in had been a point of contention between them. He said he'd warned Kathy it was a bad area. He didn't like the seedy bars and strip joints all over the place, but Kathy had refused to listen to him. The apartment was close to her work, and she told him it was not his business anyway. Bill shook his head again and looked down at the table, and Marin could tell that clearly the separation between Bill and Kathy was still pretty raw. He told Bill he had just one more question, and then he'd let Bill go home to his kids. Marin explained to Bill that based on the location where Kathy's body was found and the way her clothes were rolled up, not folded, he thought there could be a military connection. He asked Bill if any of his fellow airmen might have had a problem with Kathy, or if one of Bill's subordinates could have been angry at him. And with this question, Bill went from looking upset at Kathy to looking upset at Marin. He said no, absolutely not. His friends at the Air Force all loved Kathy, and he got along great with the people he worked with, regardless of rank. He didn't have any enemies, and no one he knew could have done anything like this. Marin sat back, studying Bill. He could tell Bill was worn out and getting frustrated, but he didn't find that particularly suspicious given the circumstances. Marin decided that the best move was just to tell Bill to go home. It was late, and he'd get better interviews in the morning. The next morning, Sergeant Marin interviewed Bill and Kathy's two young kids, and they confirmed their father's story. They had been with their dad all weekend, just like he'd said. So Marin decided he had to start from square one. First, he decided to interview Kathy's neighbors to see if anyone had spotted a person lurking outside her apartment. If the killer was a stranger to Kathy, like Marin suspected, then they would likely have found her by simply running into her somewhere, and it was possible they might have followed her home. And right away, when he started to canvass, he got a tip and a surprise because one of Kathy's neighbors told him that on the day Kathy's body was found, he saw a suspicious person walk up to Kathy's door and then just lurk there for a few minutes before walking away. And the neighbor said this person was a woman, not a man, which was not what Marin was expecting. When he asked the neighbor for a physical description of this woman, the neighbor paused and thought for a second, saying he hadn't gotten a very good look. But then his eyes lit up as he remembered one crucial detail: the suspicious woman had long red hair. Just like the 4 strands of long red hair the medical examiner had found on the victim's body. Sergeant Marin spent the next couple of days talking to Kathy's family, friends, and co-workers, probing for any information about a red-haired woman in Kathy's orbit. But not one single person had any idea who that could be. Instead, Kathy's friends and family had a different idea for a suspect: Kathy's new boyfriend. Kathy had only been dating this man for a few weeks, but she was already saying she was madly in love with him. But some of her friends thought the boyfriend was bad news. The first reason for this was because he was married. The boyfriend kept telling Kathy that he and his wife were separating and would be divorced soon. And although Kathy believed him, none of her friends did. This boyfriend also had a reputation for sleeping around and promising every woman he was with and that he was going to leave his wife for them. In fact, He was known for keeping a bachelor pad apartment where he could entertain his various girlfriends without his wife's knowledge. And another reason Kathy's friends didn't like her boyfriend was even simpler. It was because he was her boss. Kathy's boyfriend's name was Dr. David Pearl. It was Dr. Pearl who, on the Monday that Kathy failed to show up for work, sent her co-worker Sarah to Kathy's house to check on her. Kathy's friends knew she had been spending time with Dr. Pearl when she didn't have the kids with her, and that caught Marin's attention because the kids had been with their father on Saturday night, which, as far as police knew, was the last time anyone had seen Kathy alive. Marin wanted to know if Kathy had gone to meet Dr. Pearl that night, and so, a few days into his investigation, Marin found himself putting the red-haired woman on the back burner for a new number one suspect, Kathy's boss and boyfriend, Dr. Pearl. Almost a week after Kathy was murdered, Marin sat at his desk in police headquarters, making a list of possible scenarios while he waited for uniformed officers to bring Dr. Pearl in to be Dr. Pearl interviewed. He thought maybe Kathy had been pushing Dr. Pearl to get a divorce. Maybe Kathy threatened to tell his wife. Or maybe, Marin thought, the doctor's wife had already found out about the affair and taken revenge on Kathy. Marin sat back at his desk and wondered if the suspicious red-haired woman who had been seen at Kathy's apartment the day her body was found could be Dr. Pearl's wife. Just then, a uniformed officer knocked on Marin's door to tell him that Dr. Pearl was waiting for him. Marin stood up and followed the officer back to the little interview room where Dr. Pearl was sitting, looking perfectly calm and in control. When Marin walked in, Dr. Pearl immediately reached out and shook his hand, and then before Marin could ask even one question, the doctor began telling him how shocked he was by Kathy's death. The doctor said it just didn't make any sense because he had just seen Kathy a day or two before she died and she had seemed totally fine. Marin nodded, being careful to keep his facial expression neutral. When Dr. Pearl was done saying how sorry he was for Kathy, Marin looked down at his pad and asked, in a very deliberate voice, where and when exactly had the doctor last seen Kathy? And at this, the doctor went silent. Marin knew it was clear from his tone that he already knew where and when Dr. Pearl had last seen Kathy. Like he knew about the affair and it was obvious. But what Marin was doing with this question was testing how this very smooth suspect reacted to a little bit of pressure. Dr. Pearl stared at Marin for a few seconds with a polite but completely blank expression on his face, and after a tense moment, the doctor gave an apologetic smile and said, "I'm sorry, but I'm going to need to speak to my lawyer." On Saturday, June 15th, so a week after Kathy had been murdered, Marin was at home taking a day off to try to clear his head. This case had felt like trying to put together pieces from 3 different puzzles into one coherent picture. None of the clues made sense together. The posing of the body suggested a methodical killer who did not know the victim, but Marin's best suspect was Kathy's boyfriend. The rolled-up clothes suggested the killer had a military background, and Kathy's soon-to-be ex-husband was a member of the Air Force. But he had a rock-solid alibi and none of his friends or colleagues had any real link to Kathy. The sexual assault suggested that the killer was a man, but the long red hairs on the body and the suspicious red-haired woman at Kathy's door were evidence that there was a female involved. And beyond all these contradictions, there was very little in the way of actual physical evidence to tie any suspect at all to the murder scene. So, when Dr. Pearl had lawyered up during his interview, Marin had no choice but to let him walk out of police headquarters without charging him. And since then, the only thing he learned was that Dr. Pearl's wife did not have red hair and had never been to Kathy's apartment. Just then, Marin heard his phone ring and he hopped up. He hoped it was someone calling to tell him there had been a new break in the case, just like the last time he got a call at home. But when he answered, it was just more bad news. A crime scene tech told him that Kathy's car had been found in the parking lot of a restaurant a mile from her apartment. Forensic investigators had searched it for fingerprints, but they came up empty. Someone had wiped it clean? Over the next few weeks, every lead Marin tried to chase went nowhere, and slowly newer homicide cases started to pile up, and they began to take up more and more of Marin's time. Marin did return to Kathy's case every few weeks, hoping he'd spot something he missed, but no matter how many times you read the different reports, nothing in them made any more sense than it had in the beginning. A month or two into the investigation, Kathy's mother had called Marin and he promised her he would make sure that Kathy's murder was not forgotten. But as the months piled up, the case just got colder. By the 1-year anniversary of Kathy's death, the only thing Maren knew for sure was that whoever killed Kathy had not killed again, at least not in the area of Bexar County. There had been no other murders reported with the posing of the body or the long red hairs or the rolled-up clothing. By the 2-year anniversary of Kathy's death, Maren had begun to dread the calls from Kathy's family, because the only thing he had to offer them were apologies. It was not until late 1988, so more than 2 years after Kathy was murdered, that all the blurry pieces of evidence finally snapped into focus. And it happened because Kathy's family hired a private investigator. When this pie heard about the initial handling of the case and the huge mistake made in thinking that the body of Kathy Lipscomb was that of a teenage girl, he decided to start the investigation all over again. And in doing so, he discovered a critical piece of evidence that somehow the police had missed. That evidence was Kathy's datebook. In this datebook, Kathy had written cryptic notes about something called the WAPS test. The pie didn't know what a WAPS test was, but apparently someone Kathy knew had all the answers to this test and was passing them around. To the pie, this sounded like Kathy knew something about some kind of cheating scandal. Not like adultery, like actual cheating on a test. But the pie wondered who in Kathy's orbit would be taking a standardized test. It didn't make sense for anyone at Kathy's job, which was at a medical office. On a hunch, the pie called the nearby Air Force Base. And that's when he realized he was holding the link that completed the chain of evidence and broke the case wide open. Now, the pie worked with the Air Force, as well as Sergeant Marin, to bring in a man who had, until the discovery of the datebook, flown completely under the radar. His name was Clint Richards, and he had worked with Kathy's soon-to-be ex-husband, Bill Lipscomb, in the Air Force. And when investigators brought Clint in to talk, he told them everything. Based on Clint's story and evidence gathered throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Kathy Lipscomb on the night of June 8, 1996. That night, the killer sat patiently inside of their home on their couch, waiting for Kathy to arrive. They'd been expecting her, and when the killer heard knocking, they walked across the room, put a smile on their face, and opened their front door. There was Kathy, exactly on time as usual. The killer gestured for her to come inside, and she stepped over the threshold while the killer shut the door behind her. As soon as Kathy looked around the room, she realized something was wrong. It was too quiet. But the killer was expecting this. When Kathy turned to confront them, the killer pushed her to the ground and draped her. Then, they grabbed an electrical cord they had hidden nearby, climbed on top of Kathy, and wrapped it around her neck. As they pulled, Kathy tried to fight back, but after several minutes, it was too much and she stopped moving. After Kathy was dead, the killer stood up, crossed the room, and opened a cedar chest. Then they dragged Kathy's limp body across the floor. They folded her at the waist, picked her up, and jammed her inside of the chest, crossing her legs so she'd fit. Once the chest was closed, the killer called a friend. A few hours later, the killer and the friend carried the cedar chest with Kathy's body inside out of the killer's apartment and loaded it into the friend's vehicle. Then the killer handed the friend for strands of long red hair and walked back inside of their house. The friend drove off with Kathy's body in the hair. After a few minutes, the friend turned their car onto a deserted two-lane road outside of town. They pulled over, removed Kathy's body from the chest, and carefully placed her on the ground on the shoulder of the road. Then the friend set about staging the scene to look as if the killer had posed Kathy's body on purpose. They rolled up Kathy's clothing and placed it underneath her right foot, and then they laid the 4 long red hairs on top of Kathy's body. Finally, when the scene was perfect, the friend got back into their car and drove home. With Kathy's death, both the killer and the friend were now certain that no one would ever know that the killer had cheated on the promotional exam that the Air Force called the Air Weighted Airman Promotion Systems Test, or as everybody called it for short, the WAPS test. The friend who dumped the body was Clint Richards, and the killer was Kathy's soon-to-be ex-husband, Bill Lipscomb. It was Bill, the young master sergeant who had moved up the Air Force ranks with shocking speed, who had cheated on the WAPS test. Kathy knew about it, and she had threatened to expose him during their divorce because she wanted Bill to give her full custody of the children. It would turn out that Marin had been correct in his assessment that Kathy's killer had acted with a plan and had deliberately posed her body, but he had been wrong about why. Bill and Clint had worked together to stage the crime scene to make it look like a murder committed by a sadistic rapist. Those long reed hairs warp art of that staging, meant to throw the police off, and they had worked even better than either Bill or Clint had expected. And this was because of a chain of events that police themselves had set in motion in their early efforts to identify the body found on the side of Emory Road. When they believed the victim was significantly younger than she was, police had put the description of the victim out to the media, and a friend of Kathy's had heard it. That friend had been the one to make the identification of Kathy's body, but she only did so after going to Kathy's apartment to check on her. The suspicious red-headed woman the neighbor had seen was actually just Kathy's friend. It was a total coincidence, but it had confused investigators for years. Meanwhile, Bill had escaped suspicion with his alibi because he had told his young children to lie to the police about being with him all night. Bill had preemptively suggested to Marin that Marin should talk to his kids because he knew they would lie for him. It was only when the Pie began poking around on the case that Bill's 9-year-old daughter finally found the courage to tell the truth. She had not been with Hurd the night her mom was killed. Instead, her dad's friend, Clint Richards, had taken her and her brother out for dinner. That was why when Kathy arrived at Bill's house, right on time to pick up her kids, like she always was, she found the house too quiet and realized her kids were not there. When Kathy turned around to confront Bill, he raped and killed her. Clint Richards avoided prosecution for cooperating with authorities. As for Bill Lipscomb, he pled guilty to Kathy's murder in order to avoid the death penalty, and he was sentenced to 60 years in prison. However, he was granted an early release in May of 2021.